Okay, welcome back to chapter 6. And this chapter, this one might go on a bit longer than I expect because when I'm doing these videos, I'm kind of shooting from the hip. I'm not working from any sort of script or any particular plan laid out. So if you see this labeled as part 1 and the video sort of ends abruptly at some point, then that will be the reason why. This chapter, I'm not going to go over the details of the chapter in the book, and instead I'm going to go off on a lot of different tangents, which I was unable to do so in the book. Because with the book, I wanted to act like a wolfhound and just a bloodhound and just go straight at, follow the trail of the specific argument within the book. But this issue of epistemology is something which has a lot more play to it. I could have gone off in all sorts of directions, but I didn't. And that's what I'd like to use this video for, because there's a lot of very interesting points which need to be made, and they could really be books in and of themselves. And the first one is, in the last chapter, I said that sovereignty at base was a legal phenomenon. And at this point, I'm going to alter that statement a bit. Instead of saying sovereignty is a legal phenomenon, I'm going to say sovereignty is an epistemological one. And this might seem like I've gone back on the statement I made in the previous chapter, but it isn't, because law is itself an epistemological problem. And to get at this, we can start off with the issue of epistemology. Now, for those listeners or readers of the book who aren't really that familiar with philosophy, we can just define epistemology as the area of study relating to how we know what we know. If you don't know the details of that area, or you're not that particularly interested in philosophy, I don't particularly blame you. You haven't really missed out on much. I don't think philosophy itself is particularly worth studying in and of itself. It's worth studying from the position of trying to establish why people believe such bizarre things and why they believe them at the particular times and places that they did. But as a study in itself, I don't think anybody really believes philosophy is modern philosophy in particular. I wouldn't say so that's so much the case with the older forms of philosophy, but modern philosophy especially is just generally kind of worthless. I think everybody really knows that deep down. Now, with the question of how we know what we know, in its modern form, modern epistemology, this all starts with Descartes' cogito ergo sum, so I think, therefore I am. And in the book, I covered the background as to why that was developed at that time and why it became popular. And to briefly point it out here, I'll just say that Descartes and Hobbes knew each other, they met each other, and they had the same patrons who paid for their work and paid for their ability to sit around and come up with these things. And Descartes was especially supported by the Gallic Church, and it was part of a general play to kind of develop a new basis for political systems which didn't rest upon the Catholic Church coming from the papacy in Rome. So I won't go into all of that here because that's in the book. But basically, epistemology develops at this time in European history when specific political orders were changing and they needed new forms of justification for their authority. So then we have Hobbes making his particular version of epistemology along with his state of nature. You have Locke doing the same thing. You have Rousseau, and then again you have Descartes. I mean, Descartes didn't make a state of nature argument, but again, he was in that same group of people, that same movement, and it all feeds into it because Locke was responding to Descartes with his concept of the blank slate, and he was making arguments against Descartes as well. So what I want to say here is that you can organize the different political ideologies which have developed over time based upon their epistemological approach. This gets right to the root of what underpins those political ideologies, not their particular position regarding women or minorities or economics or any of that nonsense. You can get straight to the point by going to the epistemology. Now, modern liberalism is based upon the epistemologies, because there's different ones you can develop, which are all premised on the state of nature, the state of nature individual. So the type of epistemology this state of nature individual needs is the type of epistemology which Descartes came up with, this cogito ergo sum. You can't have any sort of account on how people develop their knowledge and understanding of the world around them, which is predicated on any kind of authority. That's what happens with the state of nature model as well. You have to develop an epistemological account which manages to explain how this individual, who just appears like magic all of a sudden, like the state of nature individual does, how that individual can develop an understanding of the world around him. Now, Descartes did that with the cogito ergo sum. He kind of imagined this individual locked within his head, and how could it reconstitute the world around him just based upon a very simple, well, not even simple, a very basic first principle that I think. And if starting from I think, he tried to develop all of the different complex intellectual capabilities which the person, and understanding of the world around him which the person could develop. Now, this account is just completely wrong. I mean, Alistair McIntyre has destroyed it completely as far as I'm concerned by pointing out that by using language, you are not operating from a position of nowhere. You're operating from concepts, categories, and an approach to the world which is encoded within that language. So when Descartes is using that, he's using Latin, and McIntyre points out as well, the Latin that he's using isn't Latin that the Romans would have used back 2,000 years ago. He's actually using very medieval forms of Latin to develop this. So his whole concept that you could start from completely radical skepticism, it just does not work from that position of language. And again, if we're approaching all of this in the same way we would approach a science, this would be a completely fatal criticism, and we'd just be able to put aside that whole process, just put aside that whole epistemological branch of understanding. But unfortunately, the way philosophy works, we can't order anything in philosophy. Everything has to have the same level of importance as everything else. Okay, so that is the basic epistemological basis of liberalism, which we still have to live with. So we have Descartes, we have Locke, we have Hobbes's epistemology as well. And then the first big break from this would have been Kant. And Kant, he developed an epistemology in which we don't just receive the world like we do in the Lockean account. Instead, we sort of create the world as it comes to us. And as far as it goes, that's actually not incorrect. Like we frame how we see the world through our categories that we have. Now, there's lots and lots of problems with Kant because he's still operating from this individual mind that just pops up out of nowhere, and he's right in it, as far as it goes, and in the limitations which he has, because he's operating from his modern traditionalist epistemological account. And this is kind of the thing you could see if you look at optical illusions. You can see optical illusions where you can see how your mind's ability to alter what you're seeing or reconstitute what you're seeing is actually predicated on your mind's structures. Implants on reality. I mean, we know this for a fact, but it is incredibly limited. Now, once you get this split from this basic liberal epistemology, so this early one, the Cartesian one, is what liberalism is still based on. So when you get this Kantian one, you have a different epistemological understanding of the world. And once you get this different epistemological understanding of the world, you start to get different political theories developing based upon this system. And the reason for this is because, again, epistemology is a question of sovereignty, is a question, or to put it in a better terms, it's a question of authority. Because who has authority and who has the ability to make decisions, is all predicated on epistemology. And this is something which becomes clear once you understand the origin of human orders from previous ritual sacrificial orders. Because if you look at these previous ritual sacrificial orders, or pre-modern orders in general prior to modernity, the question of who was in charge and who could make the decision was predicated on who was closest to the metaperson, or the center of that order, who could interpret the will which is coming down from that center. Now, in these, again, this is probably a bit of a bastardization and a very massive simplification of the situation here, but I want to keep it simple for the sake of the video. In these older orders, the question of objective knowledge would have been one which everyone understood as residing with the gods, God, metapersons, whatever is in the center. They were the only ones who could access objective knowledge. Everybody else's knowledge would have been contingent and tentative. So, but it wasn't. But when you get to the modern period, this changes quite drastically, because with the modern period, when we get to the Enlightenment period, this idea that objective knowledge is only with the metapersonal realm, with the other realm, gets flipped on its head, and people start to come to the conclusion that objective knowledge is completely obtainable for humans. That's kind of what the Enlightenment movement was all about. It was about kind of claiming that we could develop objective knowledge. So that's where you get this Enlightenment philosophy from. But then this starts to break down, because all of the schemes that they developed to demonstrate that they had objective knowledge of like morals and epistemology and ethics in general, it all breaks down. And then you get philosophers like Nietzsche, and they start to say, well, no, this is all nonsense. It's not. We don't have objective. It's only subjective. We can only have subjective knowledge. So then we have this dichotomy of objective and subjective, with Enlightenment stuff being objective and then postmodern being completely subjective. Now, all of this is quite nonsense. This whole objective, subjective, different categories, that's all a very modern thing. It all derives from the problems that come from having this individualist epistemology. I mean, if you Google the origins of subjective concepts of truth in modernity, you'll find that the first page you start to get is it brings you straight to Hobbes. Hobbes is one of the first ones, and Descartes as well. What's happening here is, when you don't have this center which has this objective knowledge that you're working in relation to, then you're just left with these individuals. And these individuals, if they can't create objective knowledge through some sort of bizarre, oh, I got you scheme, then it just all falls down to subjectivism. Everybody's knowledge is subjective, because you've got these completely disconnected individuals just floating around with their own conceptions of reality, and you're left with absolute chaos, which is what you have with postmodernism. Whereas we know the world is not, knowledge like that is not subjective, because in older orders they understood it, because what you have is, you could all have a specific understanding of what you think the truth should be, or the truth is. But then you all go out into the real world, and then whatever happens in relation to what you do will tell you whether you were right or not. It's like putting down a wager. So say, for example, if I say that I can fly just by flapping my arms, and you say, well, no, you can't, that's silly, it's not possible. So we both go to the top of the building, I jump off, flap my arms, and I crash into the floor and die. That knowledge is not subjective. That situation, there's no subjectivity there. We can actually test that against reality, and that's what older systems of thought, and that's what like science operates on. It's not subjective. And this is why you get such weird stuff with postmodernism, where they come up with these very strange things, like the idea that anybody could be a woman. Like, you just mutilate someone and then do some really weird and barbaric operations on them, and then they're a woman. But then you can test it. Okay, can they have children? No, then they're not a woman, obviously. Oh, we've just changed the criteria for that. And you just end up with this thing where you just go round in circles because they keep changing the categories and changing the status of what sort of what counts as evidence in that situation. But this is where the whole problem with postmodernism comes from. This whole problem of subjectivism comes from, because it comes directly from this modern epistemological framework, which itself was completely predicated on political conflict. It was developed as a means to justify the newly centralizing orders in Northern Europe, which were trying to break away from the Catholic order and the Catholic's interpretation of epistemology, because these different epistemological accounts justify these different orders. In the older account, the epistemology of older orders was putting the question of authority in the hands of the church, because they could decide to different degrees who was the rightful person to be in authority. Now, what happened in Northern Europe was the kings wanted to develop their own centralization or a break away from the Catholic Church. They had to have their own epistemology, which put them as the primary receivers of authority from God. They were the ones who could understand what was being passed down from God. So that's when you get Protestantism. And then in later periods, through a lot of complex conflicts happening at a time with many different power centers, you end up with this epistemological account of Descartes-Hobbes Locke, which is breaking away the church completely, almost completely, from this process, and placing the question of authority in individuals, who then would elect who was in authority. And so you basically, what they were kind of doing was making it so that the individuals of that order were the epistemological fountainheads. They were the ones who had access to what God was telling them. I mean, the Juvenal points this out. Popular sovereignty theories, they're still divine right theories, because what you're doing is just changing the first receiver of God's will into the individuals of that order, who then conclude who they should donate their authority to actually run the place. And then in later periods, this starts to get completely secularized, and then things go really weird, because once you completely secularize that, and you make these individuals are not interpreting the will of God or gods or meta-persons, whoever's in that center, then you end up with a completely incoherent account of how things are operating. And that's what happens with modernity, because when anybody tries to explain how somebody should have authority based upon democratic elections, they just end up going in circles. It's like they enter an error message, and they just keep looping and looping and looping around without being able to actually explain anything, which is what you find with all of modern political theory, really. They can't really explain anything because they're actually in this error loop, but they don't really know it. Now, what we have in 19th, 20th century is we have different political ideologies develop. The most notable one is Marxism, of course. Now, at the basis of Marxism is an epistemological split from liberalism. There's liberalism, modernity. It claims that the individual is capable of being the primary source of epistemological understanding. Again, cogito ergo sum, all of that, still the individual is the one who's the base of epistemology. It's not gods or meta-persons or any sort of other authority. Now, with Marx, what he does is he changes this. He works on the premise that actually our understanding of the world around us does not come to us individually isolated like that. Our understanding of the world around us is also framed and sort of bordered by our economic situation, or what he calls means of production. Now, what he's basically doing here, what he did here, Marx and Engels did here, was to basically point out that how the individual epistemologically understands the world around him is predicated on the world around him as that individual experiences it at that time. So for example, a farmer who is farming, lives in a farming community, understands everything through farming. That's how his epistemology is going to be formed. How he's going to understand the world is as a farmer. The same with a capitalist, more generally, like bankers will understand the world through banking concepts and the way they approach the world. And again, each different class understands the world and approaches the world in relation to their means of production, as you would call it. Now, as far as it goes, this is correct. I mean, how you perceive the world and how you understand the world and how you develop your epistemological understanding is a function of the world you grow up around in. And what he did by doing that, he breaks not quite decisively with liberalism, but he breaks quite a bit. Now, once you have this different epistemological understanding, then things like democracy, as in the general term, or things like that, they kind of don't make much sense anymore, because in this sense, what you're saying is that people are kind of bound by their economic situation. Again, they're bound by their means of production. And this is the basis of Marxism being a science and the whole dialectical materialism, because he's creating a materialist understanding of matters. Because in this sense, what's happening then is how those people in that order live is framing how they think, and then that's basically acting as a mechanism by which you can study them in a scientific way. Now, that's fundamentally the basis of Marxism. That's where you get all of this Marxist class conflict theory coming from, because when you have different means of production, different modes of economic living, then these different classes are going to have different interests and different demands, so they're going to end up in conflict. And what Marx and Engels came up with was this idea that the state comes along at some point, so that because what happens is one of the classes develops the state so it can oppress all of the other classes and maintain dominance. Then what happens with revolutions is that a new class develops, which is more efficient, more wealthy, and more capable, and it tries to take over the machinery of that state and turn it on the other classes and the previous class which had control of it. Now, if you look at English history, especially around the period of the Corn Laws, you could see how Marx's account actually holds some water, because the industrialists did it looks like that's what kind of happened with the industrialists and the agricultural classes in England during that period, where the industrial classes took over. This is something I'll get into in a later chapter, because he's wrong on this, but it's interesting in the ways that he is right on that. Now, part of this then means that, I'll get into this later, but that means that the state is basically a tool of the class, and what he comes up with the whole proletarian revolution is that the proletariat can take over the factories, they're super productive, they can then turn everybody into a proletariat, everybody is of the same class, then there's no more class conflict, you don't need the state can wither away, blah blah blah, all of that. Again, we'll cover that in a different chapter, but for now we just want to stick with the epistemological issue, because what he's saying then is that everybody's epistemological understanding is dictated by their economic mode of living, their means of production. So that's the epistemological basis of Marxism. That's how it differs from liberalism. That is the very basic, the core of it, really. Now, what you also had in that period is you had different political theories branch off from Marxism. That's where you get fascism, National Socialism, Zionism. Now, how they branch off is again from the basis of epistemology. That's how they separate. Now, the reason why they separate is because if you look at Marx's account of this process of an epistemological understanding being derived from our means of production, and you look at Marx and Engels' work, you can notice, which is what people like apparently Waltman did. What was his name? It was Ludwig Waltman. I mean, a lot of this you can find in A. James Gregor's book, Marxism what's the title? Sorry, to check it. Marxism, Fascism, and Totalitarianism, which is excellent on this epistemological question. Now, what you have with Marx and Engels is that their explanation of Marxism, an explanation of this class development and how class creates functions as an epistemological base, is completely unclear. It's very, very vague at many points, and that's what the fascists and the National Socialists, that's where they all branched off from it, because there's many problems with classical Marxism, and one of the big ones where the fascists split off from him was, again, this epistemological process, because the epistemology, the connection between our economic existence and how we think in Marxism, it's kind of almost comically simple. It's like, oh, we farm, and then then we start thinking like a farmer. What's the mechanism actually doing that? There's no mechanism explained as to how that actually works. Now, what you get then is you get people like George Sorrell who start to raise questions about that. And then we start to get a Kantian sort of infusion into Marxism. Because remember, Kant was saying that people's understanding of the world is actually framed by themselves, by their mental makeup, their intellectual makeup. And again, we're still in the modern process here. We're still in this modern understanding of the individual, even if we're implementing Kant. So we're not actually escaping from this problem. So then you get Sorrell's a different version of Marxism, and then that leads to fascism, Italian fascism, and actual idealism of Gentili, and all of that. So that's how you get into Italian fascism, who they got really bad rep, but they're actually very smart guys, and they weren't the bad guys in that era for definite. They were very intellectually capable and quite impressive people. But that's how Kant kind of figures back into this. I won't go into too much detail on all this because it will get quite boring quite quickly if we get too into the weeds of this thing. But that's the epistemological basis of fascism, is when you get this question about the epistemological basis of Marxism and that mechanism of how that works. Now, what you get with Ludwig Woltmann and the Germans, the Nazis, and also the Zionists as well to a large degree, is that Marx and Engels, they also stated that prior to the development of classes, people lived in something called a primitive communism. Now, this primitive communism, I mean, Marx and Engels weren't clear on this at all, whether they considered this as a class in itself, because it kind of implied it wasn't a class. But if there's a primitive communism and people are existing together prior to the development of classes, because for there to be classes, you first of all need a division of labor so that people are doing something specific that makes them part of that class. Now, Marx and Engels, again, they said before this that people lived in primitive communism, which brings us back to the previous chapters we've covered with Hobbes and with Locke and this whole idea of the state of nature. If these people living in a primitive communism, then there must be a different means by which their epistemological basis is being formed by the world around them. That's where the opening comes for people like Ludwig Woltmann and the National Socialists, because they could rightly point out that actually the communal life of those people prior to these classes was forming their understanding of the world and their epistemological basis as much as, if not more than, class. And that's where you start to get people raising the issue that, well, actually, what about race and biology? That's obviously feeding into our epistemological makeup as much as, if not more than, class. We can see that. So that's how National Socialism and that sort of area differs from the fascists in Italy as well. Because the fascists in Italy, they were kind of going from this Kantian idealism epistemology, whereas the Nazis, and then you get the Zionists as well, who are going from the Jewish angle, were focusing on the impact of biology and race and the communal structure as the formative influence on epistemology, the root from where we can get our understanding of knowledge. So that's how you can branch these different political systems off from each other. And that's something which I think is incredibly useful, incredibly informative, because this feeds back into the point that I made, that at the basis of all political authority, sovereignty, and law is this question of epistemology. Because it's from this question of epistemology that you can determine who is in authority and who can make the decisions within that order. Because political authority is not a matter of force or violence. Even when we go to questions of force and violence, if you look back in history, almost the whole of history, everybody understood that as also being an epistemological question as well. For example, if you look at like Genghis Khan, was it Genghis Khan, I believe, who when he conquered, I think it was Baghdad, maybe one of those regions, and his justification was that if you weren't such bad people, then God wouldn't have sent me to punish you. That's an epistemological argument as to his ability and right to be able to conquer those places. And you see this throughout history in many different places. For example, like in prior to the early modern period, and actually still in the early modern period, the justification for conquest of different regions of Europe wasn't one of force or of violence. The justification, as far as I'm aware, was that if, for example, Frederick the Great was able to conquer Silesia, it was indicative of the fact that he was better able to manage that area. So he was justified in being able to conquer it. Again, this is all epistemological. And if you look at prior to modernity orders, you can kind of see this in warfare in just general, because why warfare was successful was an indication that you were favored by God, which was an indication that you would have been. Well, again, they wouldn't have understood it in epistemological terms. They would have understood it as being in coherence with the metapersons or gods or whoever, which in our modern categorization of things would basically best match with questions of epistemology. You were better able to understand what the metapersons and the other world was telling you to do, so you succeeded. Whereas in our understanding, it would be you better understood what to do, so you succeeded. So again, that's the basis of political authority. And you can see that in modern political authority with the issue of democracy. Because legitimacy based upon democracy is still based upon an epistemological question. So to recap the tree, what we have here with this evolutionary tree of political ideologies with epistemological basis is that, you have liberalism, which starts with this state of nature individual who just appears out of nowhere and just absorbs reality in this comically weird, simple sense. Then you have Marxism, which branches off from this on the basis that our understanding of the world around us is framed by the world around us. Then you have the fascists who break off from that by incorporating Kantian understanding that actually our understanding of the world is also framed by our mental categories which we project into the world. And then you have the Nazis and the Zionists as well, splitting off on the basis that it's not just class that influences our understanding of the world around us, but it's race, biology, Jewishness, and what have you. And then in the modern period, one of the reasons why we haven't developed any new political theories or any sort of new ideas is because we just collapsed into postmodernism, where any sort of idea that anybody can have any sort of objective knowledge is just impossible in modern epistemology and modern philosophy, because it just is given the parameters which are in place with this. If you start from the state of nature individual, there's only so many places you can go, and we've exhausted that. We started with these kind of scammy systems to try and claim that we can access or have access to some sort of objective knowledge, and they fall apart into subjective claims of knowledge, which are completely nonsense, which is why we end up with postmodernism accounts. So the idea you could develop any sort of political theory or new idea of political authority based upon postmodern accounts is quite ridiculous, really. It's impossible. So it would seem that the only way to sort of get out of this situation or chart a new path would be to develop a new epistemological account where you would have to go back to prior to modernity and work on from there on the basis that modern epistemology has just been a complete disaster, which it really has. If you look at modern philosophy and modern epistemology on its own grounds, which is what the argument I made in the book. It just does not work. It failed, and it's failed a long time ago. If you look at it as being outsprings of political conflict and more explainable by these political conflicts, then you can correctly place these different epistemologies in their rightful places. You can order everything in the same way you could order things in sciences. And you can see why they're developing, where they're developing, what their purpose is, where they're wrong, why they have limitations. And I think that's what I managed to do in the book. And again, I'm not going to go into details of how I did that and what actually happened, because it's hard to explain verbally, and it's best just to read it, really. So, going forward, for any new political ideas to develop and new ways out of this, again, we're just going to have to go back to epistemology. And we're going to have to develop new forms of epistemology, which will demand new forms of authority. Now, how this is going to play out is not entirely clear, because the political authorities in place at the moment, those that would sponsor any sort of new epistemological ideas, new concepts, they are fully wedded to the liberal epistemology. I mean, Marxism has already fell away for good reason as well, because some of the mistakes they were making due to the errors which are ingrained in Marxism were quite incredible. I point out in the book, everybody knows about the problems that they had with Lysenkoism, but they also came very close to completely destroying their nuclear research capabilities because of epistemology, and because of Marxist epistemology especially. So our modern systems are fully bought into liberalism, this liberal individual, state of nature individual. So if you even approach that in any way, then all sorts of alarm bells are going to go off, and all sorts of responses are going to come from our political system, because our political system is completely predicated on this. Because if you look at democracy is predicated on this state of nature individual, that we all manage to spontaneously comprehend the world around us completely without any sort of intermediaries or any sort of tradition or any sort of influence from external factors. Because if we didn't understand our epistemology as being based upon that, then the idea of electoral democracy would fall on its face very quickly. Because if the individual does not come to their ideas, their wants, all of the different aspects of their reality by themselves, individually, in the way like Descartes has claimed, then our electoral democracies look like they're just manipulative systems of pretending to people, trying to convince people that they're making decisions and what's happening to them is their own choice, when it actually isn't. Because, well, think about it this way: if you toddle along and vote for, in the UK, you vote for Labour or you vote for Conservatives, if you frame that as being your internal choice, which came from within you without any external influence at all, then they can frame that as being your choice, and then they can do things, whatever they want to do, pretty much, and then they can just blame it on you and your decision. Whereas if your decision was actually framed and encouraged by them through their mechanisms of authority and their mechanisms of influence, then the decisions that they make and the disasters that they bring about through their poor decisions, it's not your fault, it's their fault. And they've just been manipulating you to get into positions to make that authority, which doesn't reflect well on them and doesn't allow them to hide their role in the positions of authorities. It's a giant mechanism for just shielding themselves away from consequences for their actions, which I think a lot of people can pretty much see anyway. So this is one of the reasons why, for example, in Marxist countries, you don't have elections, because the idea of an election when you have Marxist epistemology is quite silly. Because if all the people within your order are thinking in specific ways due to the class and their means of production that they exist in, then the idea that they can have elections that are free and fair and come to their own decisions is quite silly, because they're in many ways bound and directed by their class, and you can't run a government in that way. You have to have people in government who are fully aware of this mechanism and scientifically capable of operating within this mechanism to try and bring them to the whole Marxist proletarian future in which everybody is the same class. And that's kind of similar thing you have in, kind of similar to fascism, the fascism's kind of rejection of electoral democracy, because again, our ability to our epistemological ability is not from within us. It is shaped by things around us. It's shown by, with fascism, education was quite a big one. Again, Gentili was an educator, and so Mussolini was a teacher as well, because the world around us, our ability to understand, our education informs our understanding of the world. And the same with the Nazis. If biology is the base of our epistemology, our race is the base of our epistemology, then again, electoral democracy is kind of irrelevant. So the question then becomes like, in our world at the present, then you've got two choices really. You can either come up with some new modern account of the modern individual based upon this, which I personally cannot see, because I think it's just completely exhausted. Now, in this book and the previous book, Nemesis, I do offer a new epistemological account, but I don't hold out much expectation for this to have any particular influence on politics in general, because especially in the modern period, because these modern political systems, these modern states, are still completely dependent on this individual and this modern epistemology, even though it is failing quite drastically. So someone is going to have to come up with some sort of new epistemological account which can still work within this range, or something completely new is going to have to occur, and then we have quite distinct breaks in our political system. Now, one of the problems I think has happened is that I think our elite and the people in control of our governments and organizations and all of that, I don't think they have the intellectual capability to do any of this at this point. I think their intellectual capability is completely degraded. And one of the clearest ways I think you can see this is in looking, again, something I mentioned in previous videos and something I'll mention again in later videos, and that's human rights law. I think we see this in Europe especially. I think the European Rights Court in Strasbourg and the European Rights Law, I think the European elites, the people in the higher positions of European orders, I think they're trying to make European human rights law as being the core, the seed around which a European sovereignty can develop, which to a point is understandable, because again, law is the basis of sovereignty. Epistemology is the basis of all of that, which is the second step which they don't understand. So they understand law as being the basis of sovereignty. So I think they thought, well, if we have this human rights law, which is not based upon any nation and is kind of based upon these abstract universal ideals, so it's something which everybody is kind of equal in relation to, so it's not like German law being imposed on everybody or French law being imposed, so it's like independent, it's in the middle of everybody. So they're thinking, yeah, this will be the seed of European sovereignty, which is probably why they're also obsessed with adhering to it, even though, like in the UK, we've got people coming over in dinghies who are basically just rapists and murderers and all sorts of weird psychos who should just be rounded up, put in a camp, and just deported immediately to some third world country. Everybody knows it, but nobody will go against European human rights law, because I think, again, they want to keep it as a central point which has to be guarded at all costs, because that's the seed around which sovereignty will develop. But the problem with that is, again, they don't understand that epistemology is at the basis of all this. So if you go into human rights law and you look at human rights law, it's utterly nonsensical, because the basis of this human rights law is it's just some bureaucrats in Brussels, or as Eleanor Roosevelt in 1946 was making stuff up, and then you can't account for why those people should be able to make this law. And then also, human rights law is not locked in any way. You can change it. You can go back in and make up new human rights law. So then nobody's accounted for how it is that this should be allowable and how that makes sense. And then we end up with this human rights law where they're just making up stuff as they're going on, so it just doesn't even function as law. And this is something we'll get into in a later chapter in more detail, so as not to get too distracted. But basically, yeah, this is a very good indication that the people that are running, the people that are trying to make new superstates and new means of organization, they don't understand what they're doing. Because if you look at history and those orders which were able to unify disparate elements, like, for example, the nation of France. France wasn't a unified nation until quite recently in history. You had different regions of France which were completely separate, like Gascony, Brittany, and the way that the French kings managed to unify all those and unify those different legal systems was through a process of bringing them all together, finding discrepancies between those legal systems, and then eventually unifying it. And that was a long process. But the way they've done it in the European Union is, again, they've just dreamt up these human rights laws, which are just nonsense, said that everybody has to adhere to these human rights laws, and then they've expected the state to just develop. It's like cargo culting at state development. They don't understand what they're doing. They're amateurs, basically, and it's quite unfortunate because they create an incredible amount of chaos, and they're not going to succeed in what they're trying to do because they're just incapable. Now, in the next video, I might put the next two chapters of the book together because it's an analysis of Marxist system, and I don't think it probably I don't really think it needs two videos. I think I can explain it all in one video. And it's one of those things where it might sound boring, but it's actually quite fascinating because when you start to understand the Marxist system, and again, it helps to understand how epistemology is at the basis of all of this, and it helps to see how different political ideologies sort of sprang off from it, and how Marx was quite perceptive in his ability to see the limitations and where liberalism was wrong. In the book, I also did this because this sets up the later chapters where I put liberalism, Marxism, and the model I present in this book together and put them in a process of explaining a external phenomena which they would all recognize as one, and that's revolution. So it's where I've kind of done not quite a scientific experiment, but I've approach it in a scientific way in which I've taken these different theories as to a phenomenon and then used them to analyze the phenomenon and see which of these theories provides the most full and reasonable account of what's happening. So that's what I'll do in the next video.